This is a kind of a general map to align you, everyone, with a kind of time and space context about where exactly we are looking and what exactly is Gandhara. So as you can see, this is traditionally the area where Gandhara is to the north of Peshawar, and this is a valley of the rivers which just sort of go from north to south and then from east to west. As you know, traditionalists would say that the town of Attock on the Indus was sort of regarded as the traditional boundaries of India, and everything beyond Attock was kind of out of India. And although this core area of Gandhara is this small valley or relatively smaller area, as we shall see in the next slide, it has a much wider remit in terms of cultural exchanges. You can see that it is crucially located on the junction of many important trade routes, and by and large, the area, the remit of what happens here is sort of spreads around roughly from Uzbekistan, from the Oxus River up here, down to the Ganges or Yamuna up here, down here near Mathura. So it's a very, very wide area of cultural influence that this core area of Gandhara commands over in the entire landscape scenario. We can see that this map shows you plenty of little stupas, little things in red. I don't know whether everybody can see it because it's a small map, but you can see that there is a huge number of archaeological sites in this region, massive number of archaeological sites. And these sites have been instrumental in providing us with data or material evidence to understand our particular past in this region much better. And as you can see, that although the core area is part of northwestern Pakistan at the present, the area that the greater Gandhara covers is sort of a shared between right from Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, north of India, Kashmir to a certain extent, and somewhere around Tajikistan as well, somewhere around that part of the world. So it's a very crucial and important area in terms of time and space connotations. So when we look at the timeline, this is a kind of a rough timeline. This is, don't trust any of these dates because they are, don't take them to heart. They're sort of very rough backdrops of things. So Gandhara sort of begins in the so-called Vedic period or pre-600 BC period. And archaeologically, there is a particular culture there which has been identified as the Gandhara grave culture. And that culture comes with its own kind of defining funerary establishments and monuments and pottery, typically for early proto-historical cultures in the region. The area then comes under the sway of the Achaemenids, the preeminent Iranian dynasty. And Gandhara, as we know from inscriptional sources in the Achaemenian times, was a satrapy, was a governorship under the greater Achaemenian period. Achaemenids gave way to the Greeks, and everybody knows that in around 326 BC, Alexander appeared here in his conquest, sort of in his way to conquer the world, as it were. So the Greek periods sort of started between 326 and 324. Then there was a kind of a Mauryan interlude. Now this is where things get sort of dodgy, and you don't really know where things are lying, whether it was Mauryans got first, or whether the Greeks sort of separated and established the Indo-Greek kingdom for the Greco-Bactrian kingdom first. And that was followed by the Mauryans and the Indo-Greeks, then Scythians, Parthians, Kushans, and that sort of brings us down to kind of the first centuries AD. As we move forward on this time scale, things start getting a bit clearer in terms of our historical understanding. The period between the Indo-Greeks and the Kushans, the 4 time slots, Indo-Greeks, Scythians, Parthians, Kushans, are by far the most extensively studied parts of the story. And I'll come back to later in the presentation of why this has been the most studied part of the story. As compared to this sort of 250 BC to 250 AD period, about 500-year period, what happens in Gandhara after that period has been more or less not exactly a black hole, but it's not as well known or as well studied as this parts of a period. So Kushans give way to other dynasties, mainly the Huns, the Hunas as the Indians know it, which were in sort of ethnic groups which are then identified as Kidarites, Hephthalites, and Alkhon Huns. And they go on till about 7th century. The period after 7th century is dominated by 2 dynasties which were called the Turk and the Hindu Shahis. And then 10th century onwards, there is advent of Islam in the region. And then really things start changing. And then what might you say that the figurative art, the monumental architecture, the religious kind of stimuli goes through a big change. So we have in front of us nearly 1,000 years, or maybe 1,500 years, of great cultural activity and great strides in terms of art, in architecture, in trade, in commerce. And this area was actually thriving. I mean, it goes through low, so ebbs and flows of fortunes. It goes up and down. But by and large, it's a much inhabited, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of thriving of activities of various sorts in this particular world. So where is all the material, and what are our sort of our evidence basis for that? So there's material from Gandharan culture or Gandharan art or any other things that are essential for us to know the historical framework are scattered across the world, mainly in the West, the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Musée Guimet, and these are old, venerable institutions which hold repositories from the colonial period. And they're sort of historic collections. For example, the British Museum has the collection of one of the very early explorers in the region, whose name was Charles Masson, and who was a rather dubious character. We don't know exactly who he was, whether he was American. He was sort of operating in the age, in the time frame when Britain as an imperial power and Russia as an imperial power were contesting who holds sway over Afghanistan. And he goes there to collect what in present-day terms we would call military intelligence, but he then sort of gets into acquiring these antiquities and makes a huge collection of coins, about 80,000 coins he collects, and he sends the coins to Calcutta, where the father of Indology, one of the fathers of Indology, James Prinsep, is working on them. So there's that kind of nexus. So much of Masson's collection is in the British Museum. Similarly, Victoria and Albert Museum has collections by great antiquarians like Colin Mackenzie, who mainly collected in the south, but some stuff from the north also is there. Musée Guimet has been a repository of the French activity in the region, and I'll say more about that later on. In recent times, there have been some museums where they are relatively modern, as I say modern, but in comparison to what the British and the French have been having. So there is a private collection of a gentleman named by Mr. Schoen in Norway, and he has some interesting stuff from Gandhara. The British Library has recently acquired some interesting aspects. What was kind of the only museum solely devoted to Indian art in Berlin was the Museum für Indische Kunst, which is now sort of assimilated in the Museum for Asiatische Kunst. So it's a kind of Asiatic museum, and they have very interesting Gandharan material. Then there are sort of obscure small museums, like there was this thing called the Museum DKM in the town of Duisburg in Germany, which has somehow managed to have a fairly interesting Gandharan collection. Then there is the Oriental Art Museum in Rome, etc. Italians have had a lot of engagement with Gandharan studies. Then there are museums in the subcontinent. And then by subcontinent, I start from Kabul. Then there is Lahore, Peshawar, Srinagar, Chandigarh, Delhi, Lucknow, Allahabad, Kolkata, Baroda, Mumbai, Chennai. The one name that I haven't mentioned there is Patna. So all these Indian museums, all scattered across Indian subcontinent, have had important holdings of Gandharan material. And then there is, of course, across the pond, there is America, where the Metropolitan Museum, very well-known museums such as the Met, Museum of Fine Art in Boston, Cleveland, LACMA, several universities and smaller museums. Then another private collection in France, Montpellier, has bits and bobs. Canada. Recently, the interest in Buddhist art and archaeology, particularly in Japan, has meant that there are some interesting Japanese repositories of this collection, this kind of material as well. The Miho Museum, the Silk Road Hirayama Museum. Ikuo Hirayama was a very eminent Japanese contemporary artist, and he's greatly interested in collecting Gandharan material, and he single-handedly collected several objects, including several thousand coins. And it's been stationed in his own private museum called Hirayama Silk Road Museum in Hirayama. So these are places where there are sort of hands-on collections and actual objects which have been on display, and they have been engaged in many collaborative projects, delving on issues of chronology, issues of art history, issues of comparative analysis, many different things, archaeology, of course. And that has now, in the current climate, has led to a lot of online presence. So you don't have to go to Rome or wherever. You can sit in the comforts of your own house and look at many of these things, maybe sometimes in 3D imagery as well, and have access to this sort of material. So Délégation Archéologique France on Afghanistan is DAFA, a long series of archaeological delegations that France sent to Afghanistan. And similarly, MAIP of Ismeo from Italy, Instituto de Mediterranean de Extremo-Orient, that has a kind of project of sending archaeological teams for digging in northern Pakistan and Afghanistan. There's a project of a particular, and there's sort of site-specific projects as well. This is also very important, and they gives us kind of a microcosm of the collective, whatever was collected from a particular site. So, for example, there is Wisconsin. There is a site project called Nimogram. So, Nimogram was a particular archaeological site which is in the Swat Valley region, and very important for documenting in a sort of microcosmic level. There is the Oriental Institute of Chicago run NMF project. And at my own university, for the last 3 years, we have been having the Classical Art Research Center in the Faculty of Classics. Professor Peter Stewart has been having Gandhara Connections, which is a 3 years project. We've had 2 conferences, 2 seminars. I've given them a long 2-hour talk about coins, which is on YouTube, and you can find them on there. And that has been going on for the last 3 years. The proceedings of the first conference are already out. The proceedings of the second conference are in the bag. And the third conference, the last conference in the project, will be held in Oxford in March, exploring connections of Gandharan art with other regions in the thing. So the beginnings of Gandharan history and collecting and research go back to early 19th century, and these are sort of pictures of some eminent early antiquarians who, literally dug up various things and collected material. And one of the first persons interested in the field was Rubino Ventura, who was actually a French general in the service of Maharaja Ranjit Singh of Punjab. And he was the first person responsible for opening up the famous stupa called Manikyala near Taxila. And what he found was then documented in a sort of archaeological sense. James Prinsep, who I've already mentioned, was regarded as the father of Indology. His sterling contribution is in the wake of deciphering ancient Indian scripts, mainly Brahmi, but he also contributed a great deal to the decipherment of Kharoshthi. And he basically single-handedly started the field of Indian epigraphy and paleography, which then sort of flourished, and otherwise we wouldn't know what the inscriptions were, what the documents were. And then how can one forget Major General Alexander Cunningham, who was the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India. This is a nice picture which actually shows him with a couple of Gandharan images next to him. And they were mainly interested in the subject, particularly Cunningham and Prinsep, because they had access to classical history, the classical history of Europe, Greeks and Romans, etc. And they actually were tracing the footsteps of Alexander. That was their main project. Wherever Alexander went, because they were familiar with Alexander's histories. Say, for example, Arians and the basis of Alexander was a great history written for Alexander's campaign. And they were obviously familiar with that, and they wanted to check or corroborate whatever was said by Arian, what is actually found on grounds. And that's the reason what prompted them into the field. So the evidence structure on our hands mainly comes from, of course, there are textual mentions, which I'm a person who works on material culture, so I don't particularly delve into texts. But there are histories. There are Roman histories, there are Greek histories, there are histories written up to the first 5 centuries in the Western world, which have close bearings, which described events and close bearings on whatever was happening in this particular part of the world. But from the material culture point of view, the kind of evidence that we have on hands is obviously the monumental architecture. And this is the slide of the famous Dharmarajika stupa at Taxila. And material that came out of mainly important archaeological and other sort of efforts focused around such sites of great significance to Buddhism. In the recent past, there have been finds of birch bark manuscripts, and this is a very interesting field, which is still work is going on. These are birch bark manuscripts that date to about 3rd or 4th century AD. And they are all written in a particular script, kind of hand of Kharoshti script. And they are in the language which was a kind of Prakrit, which was sort of in vogue in Gandhara, so it is called Gandhari Prakrit. And there is still a lot of work going on in that. These were mainly discovered as accidental pillaging that happened in the last 30 or 40 years, particularly post the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And they have been carefully preserved, mainly by the British Library. There's also a project that was going on in University of Washington State University in Seattle, where Professor Richard Solomon and his students were working on that sort of material. It's a fascinating insight into the codification of Buddhist texts as we have. There is hardly anything which is of that importance that we have on hands to actually see how various Buddhist texts have emerged. So there are basically suttas of various kinds and sorts, and that's what they are about. Inscriptions have played a huge role in Gandharan studies. There have been many important linguists, Sanskritists, Prakritists who work on Gandharan inscription, and this is a particular form of the kind of context in which Gandharan inscriptions occur, which is very unique in a way. Of course, there are examples from mainland India as well, but this is a reliquary casket. And inside this casket, inside this kind of stone box, were put relics of important Buddhist persons, mainly sometimes even the Buddha himself, so they say. And then there was an inscription written on around saying that this was a particular meritorious deed of a person, that he is interring these relics for the merit for him and his family, etc. The details are written there. This is an interesting phenomenon in itself because these were inscriptions that would never have been read by anyone. So the very act of writing them is kind of goes against the grain of reading an inscription. And the fact that we are now reading it is kind of a very interesting, it provides an interesting paradox, as it were, that these things that were not to be read by anyone because they were put in a funerary monument. The funerary monument was created around it, so these were lost forever, and then now we have them because of various archaeological activities. Coinage, which is my own subject, plays a massive role into understanding of Gandharan, particularly in terms of Gandharan political history and chronology. And it is a very, very interesting coinage because, as you can see from this particular example, that it is bilingual. On one side you have, in most Gandharan coins, on one side you have Greek scripts, and on the other side you have the Indian scripts, the inscriptions in the Indian scripts. And this particular aspect helped James Prinsep, when he was deciphering these scripts for the first time, great deal when these coins were first studied. And I have chosen this particular example because this is a king whose name is Telephos, and we know absolutely nothing about Telephos apart from his coins. There is absolutely no other evidence that this person ever walked on the earth apart from these coins. And also very interestingly, they have these kind of iconographic depictions. So on the reverse of this coin, you see the sun god and the moon goddess. So there is the sun, which is radiate crown. You can see the rays coming out of his head, and the moon goddess, which has a crescent above her head. And on the obverse, there is this strange creature, which has been in, well, Western iconographic scholars describe this as an anguipede, which means a person who has snake-like legs. And we don't really know what that particular character, what that particular icon is. We don't know what particular god that was or why it was depicted on the coins of this really ephemeral person about whom we know nothing. So from these kind of perspectives, the material that shows us a very different insight into what we can know from what was the cultural ongoings in this particular region. The excavations that have led us to have a great understanding was, of course, John Marshall's great work in Taxila, and that's a consolidated volume, the book, the front cover. And you can see that it started in 1913 and went on till 1934. The book itself was published in 1953. So it's a half a century's great monumental tome, as it were, that was made possible by a hard work of John Marshall. Not just the colonial sort of archaeologists, but post-independence, there has been a lot of activity going on in the region of Gandhara. For example, Domenico Faccenna, who excavated the site of Butkara in Sawat, and here is a kind of a map of what the site unearthed. And you can see from the kind of site map that the structures they have unearthed are quite massive. I mean, it's a very wide range of structural remains that have been unearthed. And indeed, even now, presently, excavations continue in Pakistan. Now, this is something people in India find a bit hard to believe. If you believe social media, then they say, oh, well, this is not a part of Pakistan's heritage. Why even Pakistan is interested in it? But that's not the case. Pakistan owns the kind of Gandharan past much as, in fact, more than we do. And the excavations are still continuing. That's a picture from the current excavations, which is done with collaboration with the Italians in the town of Barikot, which is again in Sawat. A very important site. So the recent strides, as one can imagine, we have a lot of, in the past 50 years, let's say, there has been a great increase in our understanding of Gandharan culture and Gandharan history. So numismatics, as I said, has played a massive part, and we know a lot more in the last 50 years about Indo-Greek, Indo-Scythian, Indo-Parthian, and Kushan coins, courtesy scholars like David McDowell, A.D.H. Beavar, Joe Cribb, Robert Senior, and Robert Bracey from the British Museum. We know a great deal. Joe Cribb and Robert Bracey are currently in process of, well, have finished a manuscript catalog of all the Kushan coins in the British Museum, which is going to be a fascinating work, and they don't know, but I'm peer reviewing it. But and when it will be out, I think it will revolutionize our understanding of the Kushan history and Kushan world in general. We have a great deal of inscriptional evidence that was unearthed in the recent past, and one example that stands out amongst all is an inscription that was accidentally found through the plunder and pillage perpetuated by the Taliban at a place called Rabatak in northern Afghanistan. And there was an inscription which was written in Bactrian, in the Greek script in the Bactrian language. And it's a very early Kushan inscription which throws extremely important light on Kushan chronology, and that was published by Joe Cribb and Nicholas Sims Williams, and then subsequently annotated by Harry Falk, who is the preeminent Sanskritist in Berlin. I mean, as I said in the first map, although the area is relatively small, the impact and the implications of what goes on around that area have been quite a lot. So we have to sort of take into account advances in subjects like Bactrian and Sogdian history, which sort of covers the Central Asian parts. And again, French scholars Franz Grenet and Etienne de Lavoisier, and along with Nicholas Sims Williams, who's probably one of the 5 people on the planet who actually knows how to read and understand Bactrian language from the past, has done great, important work in this respect. The main impetus on the main sort of benchmarks on how to construct Gandharan chronology and history have been based on eras which the Gandhara inscriptions use. And we have names of various eras which appear in the inscriptions, such as the Yona era, the Aziz era, the Vikrama era, the Gondopharis era. And there have been a lot of controversies of how to reckon these eras, how these eras sort of map with AD or our current reckoning, and so that we can chronologically place these people. And again, in the past 50 years, or past 20 years, there's been a lot of stride, particularly with regard to the date of Kanishka, which Harry Falk sort of decoded by referring to a text which was called a Yavana Jataka, it's a kind of astrological text, and there were certain verses in the text which were misinterpreted by previous scholars, and Harry corrected their readings. And from those evidence, we know for fact that Kanishka ruled in 127 AD, which is a great stride because we have a very important peg to rest various chronologies on. The knowledge of political history of this period has increased quite a lot. For example, now we know that in the Indo-Scythian period, the political structure and kingship was segmented. That's a very important fact. There was a king who was the king of kings, who was Raja di Raja, and as Raja di Raja, he ruled on several other Rajas. And those other Rajas, the evidence for those other Rajas has been forthcoming. And we know that there were groups of dynasties like the Apracha Rajas in Bajor in northern Gandhara, or Odi Rajas, which were also in the neighboring valley of Hazara. And there are other satraps such as Dionysius in Jammu region. So we know a lot of how political system under the Scythians worked. When the inscriptions and, as I showed you, the scrolls, the birch bark manuscripts were discovered, a lot of effort has gone into understanding the paleography of Gandhari script and language, which was a work done by Richard Solomon and Andrew Glass in the University of Washington State University in Seattle. There has been a lot of linguistic work. One example that I would like to quote is Stefan Baums, who is based in Munich, who works on how Gandhari linguistics works. So how the names, the very interesting aspect, I mean, one of his most recent contributions is on the kind of Indianization the Greek names suffer. So for example, we saw the coin of Telephos, and although his name is written as Telephos in Greek, in the other side, his name is written as Talafasa, or something. It has been Indianized. It has been, so for example, we have Apollodotos, and his name has been Indianized as Apalladatta. So how those kind of linguistic shifts occur has been a great focus of interest of Stefan. And again, he's done some excellent work. There are people who are working on Buddhist studies and who actually see the corroborations from whatever material culture is revealing and what they know from Buddhist textual studies, such as, for example, Greg Chopin, who's a great American scholar of Buddhism. He works very rigorously on a particular school of Buddhism called Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya. And out of Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya, what we know from the actual texts, how does it kind of relate to the material evidence? It's a kind of great work that these scholars have been done. And as I said, lastly but not least, there has been a lot of excavation right from Uzbekistan, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and some particular sites worth mentioning are Karatepe and Khalchayan in Uzbekistan, Bhamla, Bazira, Barikot in Sawat. Peshawar city has seen some archaeological activity. Kashmir Shmast, which is in Mardan or Hazara Valley in Mardan district. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. And Hund, which is the kind of the ancient capital of the Shahi dynasty, which was Vahinda Udbhandapura in Sanskrit, has been recently excavated as well. This is something that we all know Gandhara for, and this has been a kind of, it's a kind of a boon and a bane in a way, because why is Gandhara famous? Because Gandhara has the kind of syncretic, wonderful mixture of East and West, and it's a very romantic story. Oh wow, look at this Buddha wearing a Roman-style toga, ha ha ha, that kind of thing. And in a way, this has been prompted by what Edward Said would call an Orientalist project by Cunningham, who was actually trying to find out, as the British were the colonizers or the invaders or the conquerors of the particular land, they were interested in finding out the footsteps of Alexander, what exactly he did. And this was, it started in that. Around the turn of the century, around early years, decades of 20th century, Alfred Fouché, who wrote this particular book called the L'Art Greco-Bouddhique du Gandhara, he was the first person to say, sort of underline and emphasize the classical, the Greek elements in Gandharan art. And then it was all taken up, it has been a part of a major part of the discourse. And John Marshall, whose book just we saw in the past slide, when he excavated at Taxila in 1953, he wrote a kind of a preface to that blue-colored book that I showed you in this one, in one of the slides. And in that preface, he sort of reminisces very romantically about how in 1913 or 14, he was a 25-year-old young man, and how he was imbued with Greek knowledge coming from Oxford, and how he saw everything in Punjab was Greece. He said, oh, there are, only olive trees are missing, everything else is Greek. So, and this kind of romantic vision led to this kind of stories of how the Greeks actually had a civilizing effect on the population and how the order was reestablished. So, for example, he says that there were two sites that he excavated. One was Beer Mount, which was all higgledy-piggledy, and it was all, topsy-turvy. And then he excavated Sirkap, which was just across at a short level. It was all orderly. So he said, wow, this is what the Greeks are doing. They are much like the British. They are bringing out order to this wild people as they were. And actually, funnily enough, what he did not recognize is that this juncture in Bir, this particular first site, was due to an earthquake. So when everything had toppled down, people, when they actually go and build something fresh and new, they would expect to have order built in it. It's human nature. It's not something which is civilizing or particularly significant in that respect. Then you have Mortimer Wheeler, who was kind of Marshall's successor as the director of Archaeological Survey of India. And then he wrote this fantastic book called Rome Beyond Imperial Frontiers. And he excavated mainly in the south, in Arikamedu, and he created this whole idea of Roman contact with India. So the focus now shifted from civilizing effect of the Greeks to the civilizing effect of Romans in this case. Both were part of the same classical tradition. And what these mainly to drive home, that is the classic head from Victoria and Albert Museum that was collected in 1932, right in the time when Marshall was finishing his excavations in Taxila. These chronological intersections are quite interesting. I think things happen. I'll show you one more example later on. Things happen exactly at the time when there are some very interesting things happening around. And you can see that this was a kind of epitome of the kind of Greekness that one sees is a stucco head of Bodhisattva, and it was sort of paraded as a kind of most significant object as kind of having the Greek influence, the curly hair and all the matter, the kind of faint, transcendental sort of smile on his face, the eyelids, the drooping eyelids. It's this kind of realism that one sees in this beautiful realism that one sees. It was all considered Greek. So style and comparative analysis were the two basic methodologies. And whatever was decided by these two methodologies, the entire archaeological and other material evidence was put in it. That has how it has been. And it still carries on. For example, this is a slide from my own university. I said Gandhara Connections project. And this is a kind of a functional box called Pyxis from the British Museum collection. This is sort of 3rd century, 4th century AD, sort of Romanesque period. And this is a Gandharan reliquary casket, much like the round one we saw earlier on, where it was interred on the stupa. And Peter Stewart, when he explains this, he calls this Pyxis, and he sort of draws the parallels between the shape and the general sort of appearance of this box kind of material here. And then quite interestingly, he calls this reliquary Pyxis-shaped reliquary. He doesn't call the Pyxis reliquary-shaped Pyxis, you see? I mean, it's coming from that sort of angle, that this is a kind of connection that is made with the kind of Hellenistic world, and all the influence is, you get a feeling that all the influence is kind of unidirectional. There is nothing going back. Everything is coming from the west to east, and the east is not giving back anything. So that has been the problem with this kind of Eurocentric aptitude. Coming more closer to the contemporary times, post-independence situation in Pakistan and India has been not very good. So after 1947 and the first years, like up to the first 10 or 15 years, archaeological research in both the countries was very much under the colonial agenda. And Mortimer Wheeler subsequently ended up being the first head of Pakistan Archaeological Survey. And within 3 years of the country being found, he wrote a massive book called 5,000 Years of Pakistan. And, so it was right from that one, the kind of thing to appropriate the past was very much there. There have been great, nice scholars in the early part of this period between 1947 and where we are. There was Abdul Hasan Dani, who was a great epigraphist who did lots of interesting work about Gandhara inscriptions. There was A.K. Narayan, who wrote about coins. There was Bruthindranath Mukherjee, a great scholar from Calcutta, who wrote consistently about iconography. And there is Muhammad Nasim Khan, who's probably the most current leading light in Peshawar about things Gandharan in Pakistan. In the Indian sort of disciplinary discourse, the textbook and those kind of things, Gandhara sort of disappears. Again, they go on to tell you the sort of old stories about how Greek it is and how the cultures sort of intermix. But they don't really tell you anything more than that. It's still sort of stemmed in this kind of very colonial understanding of what Greek and what Roman influences were in Gandhara. They don't tell you anything about, say, the recent strides about how the Rabatak inscription that was found tells us that the Kushans themselves regarded themselves as an Iranian, so they appropriated the Iranian cultural past more than they did anything else. And that story is entirely missing. I mean, Iran is a massive landmass that sits between East and West, and Iran is practically not present in any of this discussion. And it also has an equally important and significant cultural collective, much like India. So, that must have had some impact on these movements that were going on. But that story never appears in the story. The access problem has been very, very important, very crucial. As I said, we have a huge repository of Gandharan art in India. And if I want to say research particular aspects of an image in, say, Indian Museum in Kolkata, or indeed in Chhatrapati Shivaji Vastu Sangrahalaya in Mumbai, and I want to have access to similar material in Pakistan, it's very difficult for me to get that. It happens in rare instances, but in general, it's quite difficult. So the repositories of the same cultural material in both countries have gradually become quite inaccessible. There has been absolutely hardly any collaboration in archaeological projects. I mean, Gandhara is being dug up by the Brits, by the Americans, by Italians, by French, but not Indians. I mean, that doesn't really happen. The more worrying scene that we see from UK particularly is the disappearance of essential skills. There are some essential skills that one needs to know about Gandharan art or study Gandharan material. So, for example, you need to know Prakrit, you need to know Sanskrit, you need to have access to or learning how to read ancient Indian scripts. And that is, particularly on Pakistani side, that is disappearing very fast. There are not many people, and we have someone like Hemant, for example, who can teach Sanskrit to other people. And we have a great degree of that sort of body of skills here, skill sets here, which we can engage with better from on the other side. Pakistan and Afghanistan, because of political conditions as well, play a role in this. But they still look to Europe or to the US as nodes of engagement and funding. So everything that is happening in this is through the kind of, the Western world. And of course, that brings about its dangers, as I said, because they obviously have their own sets of methodologies. I'm not questioning the validity of those methods, but I'm questioning that there has to be some sort of, a kind of an alternative methodology as well, because of course, they are Europeans. Their methods will be Eurocentric. There is nothing stopping, there's nothing saying against that. And, certain political situations, particularly, say, for example, Kashmir is a good example where political situation will mean that, and Afghanistan is another massive example of political situation actually leading to a complete vacuum as far as main things are going. The other, this is my favorite bugbear. Buddhism pays. I mean, anything that we want to do with Buddha, the Japanese are interested, everything, the money is interested. But anything really doesn't, the Gandharan studies, Buddhism sort of goes on declining in Gandhara from 5th century onwards. So 5th to 7th century, Buddhism declines. There is a major social transformation to other religious systems, whether they are Hindu or Brahmanic or whatever they are, or, in sort of Iranian as well, to a certain extent. But they are not really that sexy. I'm sorry to use that word, but and they don't actually, people are not really interested in that particular. So that makes the entire gamut of Gandharan studies quite skewed towards Buddhism and towards these first 4 centuries of the Common Era. And nothing sort of goes between 5th century is not really reflected. So these are the current kind of situation that we are in. And then there are some particular problems. These are, of course, there are ideological problems, such as I just outlined that particular inquiries are about Eurocentrism, but then there are particular problems that I'll highlight. The first problem is, of course, destruction, and that has been a kind of an outcome of the political past and the political current situation. So, this is a heartbreaking image for anybody who's interested in Gandharan studies, that the great Bamiyan Buddhas, and everybody knows about this. Everybody knows about Bamiyan Buddhas being destroyed, etc. But what is also interesting is that there has been not much, the professionalism that goes on into various things has been under question as well. So this is a kind of, that's a picture from the Kabul museum that was looted. You can see everything is, is helter-skelter. And there has been this sort of kind of looting and plunder kind of stories going on. So a lot of people sort of dig up these kind of things and they offer them on international market. And everything is done, if you read any, if you just Google for, illegal excavations, Gandhara or something like that, huge amounts of Pakistani newspaper coverage comes up on Google. And you see that they are actually harping, and there is a very much similarity that we see in India as well. You have a haul of some antiquities somewhere on the airport, and the first thing that the police said, oh, it's worth crores. And they say, well, this is worth $10 million in the international market. So it's all hyped into a great sort of level. And that sort of creates a kind of, it has a positive and a negative impact. The positive impact is that, of course, people, become more aware. The negative impact is as they become more aware, they start digging again. So because they are sitting on this kind, they think that they are sitting on this kind of treasure trove as such. Then there are, again, 2 clippings from Pakistani newspaper. And then there are these kind of, lack of professional engagement with the subject. So this stupa at Jolian, which was a kind of a Taxila site, and you see that they said that they wanted to reconstruct the faces that were sort of destroyed by whatever, and they started reconstructing it, and it was not it was sort of alleged that it was not really done in a professional manner. Permissions were not sought. The bureaucracy works in a particular way. And then again, we have this kind of stories about smugglers who are exporting these antiques, and they are recovered. They're seized by the police, and the police doesn't know what to do with it. So after successful rescue, third century figures are destroyed at the police station. And this is, again, this sort of skews the entire picture in such a way that everything that we see, common people do not understand. I mean, for all of us, most of us, this image looks pretty standard Gandharan. So even does this. It's pretty much, it looks like a proper Gandharan artifact. And we don't know that there has been an industry as well at play. So the current problem that we have is because of the kind of the route that the subject has taken, the connoisseurship in actually knowing what is good art, what is bad art, what is a genuine artifact and a fake artifact is being lost. And the entire field is being contaminated by objects which are of mainly dubious nature. They are not provenance. We don't know where they come from. And then subsequently you have this one. 90% Gandharan artifact seasons in are fake. And this is a report submitted by the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Archaeological Department, who, when the kind of haul of antiquities was found or seized at Karachi airport, they came down from Peshawar to examine it, and then this was the case. So it's becoming a great problem in the current climate to see what is genuine and what is fake, and that has been a serious concern, because much as everybody would like to repatriate objects and relocate them, we also have to think about where exactly, what are we going to do with when they come back, and whether they are actually worth all this hype. So some of them, and I can show you. So for example, this is a picture from a London-based art dealer. And this appeared in a catalog, and everybody started raving about the fact that this is supposedly found in, again, dubious provenance. It was described as found in salt ranges. And there is a particular temple site in the salt ranges in northern Punjab called Katas. And this was supposedly discovered at that particular site. And it's an odd image. I mean, we have Saryu here, which is, we say this is it has got lots of interesting syncretic aspects in it. It is not your normal Narasimha. But hey, syncretism is the basis of Gandharan art. So let's, what's wrong? Let's have a mishmash. It makes it look more exciting, yeah? And it gives something to academic to chew about. And then you have this particular, the kind of discussions that people were having about was this head. And this head is like a linga-shaped head. So I mean, this is an really odd feature, this kind of, round head. So it's this kind of syncretic object. It is Shaivism and Vaishnavism combined. Then it has this kind of, the wheel and the gada at one hand. And this kind of, shankha and this akshamala, the kind of rosary in one hand. And a lot of discussion went on. And then subsequently, this appeared. And the similarities are immediately apparent. It's obviously this image is copying this image in all respects, yeah? In terms of the conch, the thing. But what is very interesting is that this image is from Bhagalpur in Bihar. And there is no connection. There is absolutely impossible. This is a kind of 8th century early Pala image from Bhagalpur, which has been sort of a kind of an influence for a kind of factory somewhere in northern Pakistan. And this was published by Jimmy Hall, who was a very eminent, he was at my museum, and he was the keeper of Indian art for a long time, a very, very respected scholar. But this is not published in a famous journal. This is in some obscure journal, we don't know. If only people who actually dig into these matters would find it. And this kind of activity that is going on has been extremely dangerous, because we don't know. Rarely we find a parallel like this, but a lot of images have appeared apparently from Katas, apparently from salt ranges or wherever they are, and they are all odd images. Like there is a Brahma which has 3 heads and something like that. So all sorts of mishmash kind of imagery occurs, and we don't know exactly what is genuine and what is fake. The same thing applies for coins, my own subject, and these two coins were of extremely dubious origin. That is a gold coin. It's a very rare thing to have an Indo-Greek gold coin, for example. This is the fact that this coin is gold itself is quite exciting. And this is a king whose name is not known in any other sources. We have a repository of 28 names, and this guy is called Heliodotos. We don't know who this person was. And if you actually see the articulation of the Kharoshthi letters and everything, Harry Falk suggested that this has to be a fake, because the way the letters are engraved and the way the letters are written is not right. It's not the way that it sort of matches. Similarly, this is another example of a sort of coin that appeared out of the blue, and this is supposedly a youthful head of Apollo, and this is a kind of a symbol of Apollo, which was called an Apollo's tripod, and this is a kind of a monogram that appears on many Indo-Greek coins. What is interesting is this particular thing here, and this is supposed to be a Kharoshthi letter. Now that is a feature that is unknown. So the people sort of invent these things which make collectors happy, and collectors would go for it. And again, extremely dubious. We don't know whether it is genuine or fake. The second thing that is happening, particularly in Pakistan, in terms of coins, is that they are sort of engraving the material on this coin. So for example, when this coin was found, it might not have been in good condition. It might have got a lot of patina, a lot of accretions on it, natural accretions, as it was, the coin is genuine, coin is perfectly genuine. But what they have done is to enhance its condition, they have re-engraved the entire thing. So they have actually, maybe with a dental drill or I don't know how, but they have gone over it and they have re-engraved all these letters to make them more clear than they originally were. So this is kind of tampering with evidence that goes on. And again, as I said, Buddhism pays, Buddha pays. So Buddha is very exciting. So this is a coin of a late Kushan king, Vasudeva. And on the reverse, one should have a standing Shiva. But what they have done is that they have cut the standing Shiva. That particular portion is actually the Shiva's Nandi. That is behind the Shiva, and this is Shiva. And they have sort of recut it into looking like a Buddha, seated Buddha. So this sort of tampering is very much evident in the market. And again, only people who are aware of methodologies, only aware of, have this kind of hands-on experience with these objects will tell you this. Otherwise it's very, very difficult for a layperson to tell you, see this. So this is sort of, contaminating a lot. The other thing is about the problems of interpretation. This is an interesting piece. This was a big coin that was found in 1875, and first mentions appeared, and immediately this was interpreted as the image of Porus battling Alexander. And I've written a long article about this called Not Just a Pretty Face. And this was all about interpreting the Alexandrine imagery on coins. And to cut a very long story short, this particular representation was interpreted 3 times in 3 different manners. And the first time it was interpreted in a particular manner was in 1906, when there was Swadeshi movement in India. The second time it was interpreted in a particular manner was in 1932, non-cooperation. And the third time it was interpreted in a particular manner was 1977, when Britain was about to join the European Common Market. And all these interesting historical, the kind of discursive, general discourse about these events find a reflection in how that imagery was interpreted. So scholars, historian, philosopher of history, Collingwood said all history is contemporary history. So that you can easily, clearly see that there were ongoings in around these scholars who were actually seeing the reflections of what was going on. By default or by choice, I don't know. I mean, I have no idea how this was done, but you certainly see that how this image was interpreted. But hey, again, this image is the classic thing. They even said that because the elephant was going towards here, he is retreating, and Alexander is attacking, and the elephant is retreating. I mean, what? I mean, you see motion in a motionless object. I mean, what more can be more fanciful than an interpretation? But when the movie Alexander came, this was the scene. So you can see that this is taken from the clip, and it is absolutely copied from the coin image. And as we know, we have a different story. When you talk about movies, we have Sohrab Modi's Sikandar. Again, 1941, just on the verge of Quit India movement. And we have a different story to tell. And everybody knows that, Shashi Kapoor as Sikandar and Sohrab Modi as Porus. We all know the story as something, oh, treat me like a king story, that story. It's not the kind of story that the Western scholars interpreted that particular coin image as. So there has been these kind of two dimensions of interpretation. So what do we do? A kind of interesting radical question, Lenin asking, "Sto delat?" What is to be done? And we have more, how do we take these things forward? So first of all, we have to own up Gandhara as a shared heritage, avoiding notions of four nationalisms. We should not say that this belongs to India, this belongs to Afghanistan, this belongs to Pakistan, whatever, and wash our hands off. We should actually engage, because this is, after all, a shared cultural heritage which has been divided mainly by the colonial project, because the borders are all drawn by our erstwhile colonial masters, and we are sort of slaves of that kind of thing anyway now. We need to have better engagement. We have to have provisions of access, very important, and exchange of skill sets, particularly for epigraphy and languages. We need to train scholars on the other side of the border and engage with them in transferring our skill sets which they are lacking. There are very interesting global perspectives emerging. For example, as China becomes the big player in all these politics, they are talking of maritime Silk Route. And that is the kind of Silk Route that connects from South China Sea through the Straits of Malacca, through Sri Lanka, up into the Arabian Sea, and then further on. So that is a kind of counterpoise to the terrestrial Silk Route that everybody talks about. And again, there is a Gandharan connection there as well, because the main body of water that links the maritime activity with the terrestrial activity up north is the Indus. And Indus plays a hugely important role in bringing these two kind of worlds of networks and trade together. We have great amounts of evidence to that effect, particularly from 3rd and 4th century, but also from earlier, so 2nd or 3rd century as well, in terms of, say, coins, which is, again, I can speak more effectively on. There has to be an engagement in pedagogy, which is reviving teachings of Gandharan studies on both sides of the divide, because we have to again talk about Gandhara. We can't really just say, oh, well, this is all, Roman, Greek, whatever, and oh, this is all beautiful, this is realistic, and that's why. And, there is, in terms of actually bringing down to what I would say as grassroots education, not the textbook education, there has to be a change. As I said, there has to be more awareness in the scholarly discourse about archaeology on one side, and this kind of old-fashioned connoisseurship, where that tells you about how to study object in an object base, not for its archaeological context, not for what it is, it shows what the associated finds are, etc. But as an object, we should learn more and know more about how to study those kind of things. Again, this is again my favorite subject, that we need to shift the focus, for heaven's sake. It's high time that there is Gandhara beyond 5th century AD as well. And Buddhism gradually disappears, Greeks fade away, Romans fade away, everybody goes away, but Gandhara continues. Gandhara continues for another 500 years after this, and there has to be a focus on that particular part. There is a need to build bridges to clear an atmosphere maligned with scholarly disengagement from within the subcontinent and malpractices such as forgery, which I said, there has to be some sort of addressal of that. And we need to shift the discourse a little bit from the generic Gandharan art and archaeology, and we have to focus more on the Kidarite and Hunnic period onwards, Gandhara is extremely interesting, extremely exciting when the Huns appear. We still want to believe Xuanzang, who said the Huns were the destroyers of Buddhism. Current evidence tells us something completely different. Current evidence tells that the story is much more nuanced than the Huns being rotten, wild people who were, sort of brought about this kind of wrath of destruction and deluge on the population, on the settlements, etc. And there is a great deal to learn about that. A quick look upon what kind of things that it reveals. This is a site called Tepa Sardar, which is just outside Ghazni. You can see that in the map. There is Fondukistan, there is Tape Naranj, this is Mes Ainak, which everybody knows, because it's a very important site. And this is Tepa Sardar near Ghazni. And the archaeology that the Italian archaeological mission has revealed from 6th century, 5th century onwards is extremely interesting. We see similar artistic features as were perfected in Gandharan art, the same sort of realism. This is the head of a Durga that was found there with the third eye popping out. And we have actually found evidences of Yajna worship. This is a kind of fire altar. Whether this was Brahmanic fire worship or whether it was Sasanian or Zoroastrian, we don't know. Probably both intermixing in this particular region. So these are kind of new exciting finds. Similarly, we have the kites of Kashmir Smasht, which is in Mardan, which is in the top end of Gandhara here. And this is a great cave. And it's almost like a fertility goddess shrine. These two mountains on either side of this cave. The cave is actually nearly 1.5 kilometers deep. And it sort of spreads into various branches inside. And these two mountains next to it are almost like the feet. And the cave is actually the kind of birthplace of civilization, the kind of the primordial goddess, the vagina of the primordial goddess in here. We go in and worship this great place of creation. And recently we have found some extremely exciting material from that, such as these Lajagauri seals. And this is the northernmost site where you have the Lajagauri images. And we know from these seals that this particular goddess here was called Bhima. And this shrine is also actually mentioned in Xuanzang's account. And on one hand, you have these kind of very interesting assimilations of the Lajagauri. Next to it is a trident, which is evidently a Shaivite symbol. So you see lots of interesting cultural movements coming into play here. Similarly, these are the seals. That is, the font has gone haywire. But it says on this particular seal, the inscription here is Shri Bhimaya Guha Vasinya, Sanskrit inscription. So this is the Bhima which is residing in the Guha, in the cave. So this is what it is. And up here you have this seated Lajagauri, sometimes without head, as the Indian fashion is, you show her with a lotus head, and sometimes with a proper human head as well. So that is the one with the human head. Similarly, this particular seal, the inscription here is Shri Swami Nalapura Vasina Nalapura Vasine Deepta Saha Pungave Mihire. So this is a particular shrine, that particular inscription that refers to this kind of fire altar with the two attendants, which is a very Zoroastrian imagery. But the actual mention of the person who has that seal is mentioning that this is the illumination of the sun, which is with the bull. It is Saha Pungava. So it is, in Sanskrit, it is referred to as a kind of, so this is a very interesting cultic insight of what exactly the kind of religious movements were going on here. So these are very much part of Gandharan story, much as the earlier Buddhist and other accounts are. So this is the time, this is the kind of interesting aspects that we need to sort of focus more on now. And the kind of skill sets that we have in the subcontinent and the kind of engagements that we can build, this is the kind of focus that can be easily achieved given the kind of mutual collaborations and cooperations that we can do. So here was a kind of a long-winded introduction exploring Gandhara in terms of more recent problems, historic problems, and what the way forward lies. So that's where I end my talk. Thank you.
धन्यवाद